Demon Slayer is perhaps the most popular anime and manga franchise ever. However, the series also receives a lot of skepticism and incredulity. Detractors say its quality of story does not reflect its sheer level of popularity. So is Demon Slayer only mid and merely carried by its animation? Did it only become that popular merely because it happened to be released at the perfect moment? Unlike in other cases, where popular series receive a lot of critical doubt or skepticism, most of the detractors aren't saying the series is outright bad, only that it's merely moderately above average, or mid. So the series' insane popularity does not correspond or reflect its level of story quality. So why has the series become insanely popular in spite of being merely above average or okay? So can the detractors' position be somewhat justified? I am not saying Demon Slayer is bad by any means, just that it's not exactly on the level of Fullmetal Alchemist, Steins Gate, Attack on Titan, Yu Yu Hakusho, or Chainsaw Man. Those series have a level of complexity, characterization, world building, or thematic depth that Demon Slayer generally doesn't get to. Demon Slayer is very effective at what it's trying to do, but what it's trying to do is relatively simple. Saying Demon Slayer isn't one of the greatest written stories of all time is not the same thing as saying it's a bad story. A series can be extremely successful without being the most complicated story ever written. Demon Slayer has simple one-dimensional characters, a simple plot, and character relationships. If a story has only one of these features, it can still be a great, top-tier story. But having all three at once means the story is going to be somewhat lacking, and just not at the highest, most top-tier level. Other than the fights, there isn't that much to the table the story can bring, other than a little humor. The characters' personalities aren't always terribly complex, they don't behave differently in different situations in an obvious or semi-predictable way, so in spite of the fact that they sometimes have significant and substantive backstories, it doesn't completely translate into their complexity at the time of the series in the moment during its run. This is an important distinction. Having a sad backstory does not automatically make a character complex. A character can have an incredibly tragic childhood, lose everyone they love, and experience years of hardship, but if they still react to almost every situation in basically the same way, then the backstory gives them emotional weight without necessarily giving them a complicated personality. So if they behave and react in exactly the same ways in every situation or circumstance, then they have simple, not as complex personalities. Again, on its own without any other issues, that wouldn't be a problem, but when you combine it with all these other facets at once, it becomes an issue. The plot is very simple and really doesn't have that much fueling it without the fights. So if you were to completely remove the fights from the series, there really isn't too much there left. While a top-tier series would have a complex and engaging plot that would stand on its own and be engaging even without any fights or action. Certainly, if they didn't have any complex characters and character interactions to make up for a more simple plot. Demon Slayer's story is basically a straightforward journey. Tanjiro wants to save Nezuko, find a way to turn her back into a human, and defeat Muzan. Along the way, he encounters demons, meets stronger allies, becomes stronger himself, and gradually works his way toward the final confrontation. There are plenty of individual events and battles, but the overall structure is very easy to understand. Though in fact, the simplicity is part of the appeal. You almost always know what the characters want, what the immediate objective is, and what the stakes are. The audience rarely has to keep track of a huge web of political factions, hidden motivations, complicated timelines, or dozens of competing objectives. So series can also have problems going completely too far the other way with this. The characters' relationships are simple and standardized. The characters' relationships are established almost the exact same way they will be for the rest of the story as soon as they first meet. And the character relationships stays almost exactly the same throughout the entire story. And they seem to interact with everyone in standard, consistent ways, without variation, regardless of the person or circumstances. The character relationships are just as static. The moment two characters meet, their dynamic is locked in stone, and it barely changes for the rest of the story. Tanjiro is compassionate. Zenitsu is frightened and loud. Inosuke is aggressive and competitive. Their basic personalities are established very quickly, and while they certainly have moments of growth, those basic patterns don't fundamentally change. Again, there are some benefits to this. You immediately know what kind of interaction you are going to get when these characters appear together. It makes the cast extremely accessible. The show also has some glaring plot holes. For example, the final selection setup makes absolutely no logical sense. The organization runs like a literal meat grinder exam that slaughters its own recruits while facing a severe labor shortage. Later on, Nezuko conquers the sun purely through sheer willpower, breaking every established rule of demon biology. It would have been much more elegant if a character like Lady Tamio had developed a serum beforehand, giving us a logical payoff instead of a sudden miracle. But the show is so beautifully animated and fast-paced that most people don't even notice most of these flaws on first watch. And that exactly is why the show is so successful. The issues are there, but Demon Slayer is incredibly good at preventing you from thinking about them while you're watching it. The pacing keeps moving, something visually spectacular is almost always happening, the scene tells you how you're supposed to feel, the characters are expressive and memorable, the action has very clear stakes, and every new technique feels important. So the series also has some giant plot holes that aren't great, but saying that is a core reason why it isn't top tier isn't fair. Even a lot of the greatest, most critically acclaimed anime also have some of them, and they get a pass on them if they do everything else right. So critics of Demon Slayer can sometimes become too focused on proving whether every individual plot point makes perfect logical sense. Most long-running anime have inconsistencies somewhere. The real question is whether those flaws prevent the story from being enjoyable. In Demon Slayer's case, for most viewers, they don't really do so. It's a simple, straightforward story that viewers find engaging and easy to digest, and become invested in. The characters are likable and compelling, and it's easy for audiences to get attached to them. And that might actually be more important for popularity than having the most sophisticated quality writing possible. Demon Slayer is also popular because of the show's stunning animation. So yes, partly the show is carried by its good animation, but saying it's carried by the animation can sometimes sound more important than it really is. Animation is part of the experience. The show came out at exactly the right time in 2019. At that point, social media had developed enough so that clips of its stellar animation and striking scenes could be shared on social media and go viral, generating huge momentum for the show. This got a lot of eyes on the series and fueled its popularity until it was one of the most successful shows ever. And Demon Slayer was particularly well suited for this environment. You could take a few seconds of animation from an episode and immediately understand why people were impressed. A striking sword technique, a dramatic character expression, or a beautifully animated attack could circulate online completely outside the context of the episode. Someone didn't necessarily have to be an anime fan to see one of these clips and think, wait, what is this? It was also just before the pandemic, when most people were stuck at home and given off work with nothing much else to do but watch entertainment on their television. That also sent a huge audience watching things like anime right when the show was new and one of the prime series that these expanded and new audiences could pick up. The timing really could not have been much better. Demon Slayer was already becoming successful, social media was amplifying it, and then the pandemic dramatically increased the amount of time millions of people had available to watch television and streaming services. Once people started watching, the show's straightforward story and incredible presentation made it easy to keep watching. And this creates a feedback loop. More people watch it, more people talk about it, more clips circulate, more people discover it, and then even more people watch it. Eventually, the series stops being merely popular among anime fans and becomes recognizable even to people who don't normally watch anime. That brings us to a big question. The show is almost done, so it doesn't matter as much, but it raises the question of what happens when that quality of animation simply becomes standard for most new anime. For instance, I was just watching The Exiled Heavy Knight Knows How to Game the System, and it's just a run-of-the-mill, seasonal, isekai slop anime, but it has some of the best animation I've ever seen on a television anime. And I mean slop in the most loving way possible. Seriously, go watch it. At some point, amazing animation stops being a unique selling point and starts becoming the baseline. If that happens, then new anime will need something else to distinguish themselves. Better characters, more complicated relationships, stronger plots, more interesting themes, or maybe simply a different style. That doesn't diminish what Demon Slayer accomplished. In fact, it may make its success even more interesting. Demon Slayer didn't necessarily become one of the biggest anime franchises ever because it was the single most brilliantly written story ever created. It became one of the biggest series because it combined a simple and accessible story, likable characters, emotional moments, spectacular animation, great pacing, strong presentation, and incredibly good timing. You don't necessarily have to be the most complicated, sophisticated, or intellectually challenging series to become a phenomenon. You just have to be really good at giving audiences something they immediately understand, immediately enjoy, and immediately want to share with other people. Demon Slayer did exactly that, and whether you think it's one of the greatest anime ever made, or merely a very good and extremely well-produced battle shonen, there is no denying that it found a formula that connected with an enormous audience. The interesting question now is whether Demon Slayer was a once-in-a-generation combination of story, timing, technology, and cultural momentum. And what comes next once the baseline for animation gets raised above the level Demon Slayer entered with? Subscribe to my channel if you want to see more anime analysis videos like this, and if you liked it. Share this video on social media.